Blood soaked rapidly into the pristine white uniform of the estate's quietest maid, blooming like a dark, terrifying rose. 3 hollow-point bullets. That was the exact price of a child's life in the brutal, unforgiving underworld of the Falconee family. As security alarms pierced the tranquility of the afternoon, Dominic Falconee, a man who ruled the eastern seaboard's criminal empire with an iron fist, fell to his knees in the manicured grass. He wasn't looking at the fleeing assassins. He was staring at the 22-year-old girl bleeding out over his 6-year-old son, her broken body forming a desperate human shield. In that chaotic, blood-drenched second, Dominic didn't just scream for a trauma team. He called for a priest. He was going to make her his wife, right there on the blood-stained lawn, before she took her last breath. To exist in the sprawling, 40-acre Long Island estate of Dominic Falconee was to master the art of invisibility. Amelia Stanton understood this better than anyone. At 22, she was the youngest member of the household staff, a girl who moved through the cavernous, marble-floored hallways like a phantom with a feather duster. She kept her eyes lowered, her voice soft, and her presence minimal. In a world populated by men in tailored Brioni suits who carried concealed weapons and discussed multi-million-dollar illicit shipping routes over espresso, being noticed was the most dangerous thing a civilian could be. Amelia had not chosen this life out of a fascination with the criminal underworld. She was trapped in it by the cruel mathematics of poverty. 2 years prior, her father had passed away, leaving behind a staggering $200,000 debt to a ruthless faction of the Irish mob operating out of South Boston. The loan sharks had come collecting, threatening her younger sister Lily, who was entirely dependent on Amelia. The job at the Falconee estate, secured through a desperate connection of her late father's, was a lifeline. The pay was exceptionally high, entirely off the books, and strictly cash, most of which went directly into the envelopes she handed to terrifying men on the first of every month. Her days began at 4 in the morning. Under the strict, watchful eye of Rosa, the head housekeeper, Amelia polished mahogany, scrubbed imported Italian tile, and ensured that the sprawling mansion remained a pristine sanctuary for its dark master. She knew the rules: never enter the West Wing during meetings, never look the boss in the eye, and never, under any circumstances, ask questions about the sudden disappearances of certain guards or the late-night arrivals of black medical vans. Dominic Falconee, the head of the family, was less a man and more a terrifying force of nature within the walls of the estate. At 34, he possessed a cold, devastatingly handsome exterior that masked a ruthless, calculating mind. He had inherited the syndicate in his 20s after his father's assassination and had spent the last decade violently consolidating power. He was rarely seen without his right-hand man, Vincent, and a phalanx of silent security personnel. To Amelia, Dominic was a storm cloud she actively avoided. But there was one inhabitant of the estate who tethered Amelia's heart to the cold, echoing mansion: Leo. Leo Falconee was 6 years old, a boy with soft, dark curls and his father's intense grey eyes. However, unlike his father, Leo's eyes were filled with a profound, aching sadness. 3 years ago, a rival syndicate had planted a car bomb intended for Dominic. Dominic had survived. His young wife, Clara, had not. Leo had been in the vehicle behind them and had witnessed the inferno. Since that day, the boy hadn't spoken a single word. He was a ghost in his own home, shadowed by nannies who treated him more like a fragile, broken vase than a child. Dominic, consumed by grief, guilt, and the relentless demands of his bloody empire, loved his son fiercely, but kept his distance, unable to look at the boy without seeing his dead wife. This emotional vacuum left Leo adrift. Amelia first noticed him sitting alone in the estate's vast library, staring blankly at a sprawling picture book. The nanny on duty was engrossed in her phone. Amelia, tasked with dusting the upper shelves, had accidentally dropped a heavy leather-bound encyclopedia. It hit the floor with a resounding thud. Leo had flinched violently, scrambling under a heavy oak desk, his small hands covering his ears, trapped in the memory of the explosion. Without thinking of the rules, Amelia had abandoned her duster. She didn't try to pull him out. Instead, she slid under the desk with him. She didn't touch him or speak loudly. She simply pulled a small silver pocket watch from her apron, a cheap trinket that belonged to her grandfather, and popped it open. It played a tiny, tinny, soothing lullaby. She placed it on the floor between them. For 20 minutes they sat in silence under the desk, listening to the watch. Eventually, Leo lowered his hands and watched the small gears turn. When Amelia finally slid out, Leo followed. It was the first time in years the boy had engaged with anyone unprompted. From that day on, a quiet, secret bond formed between the Mafia heir and the debt-ridden Maid. Amelia learned to read the boy's silent cues. When the house was tense with the arrival of underbosses, Leo would find her in the laundry room, hiding among the warm, freshly dried sheets. Amelia would sneak him extra slices of peach cobbler from the kitchen, and in the sun-drenched greenhouse, she would tell him fantastic, whispered stories about brave knights and gentle dragons. She became his safe harbor. She never pitied him, never tried to force him to speak, and never treated him like a piece of collateral. To Amelia, he was just a little boy who needed a mother. She loved him with a quiet, fierce devotion that she kept entirely hidden from the terrifying men who ran the estate. She thought she was invisible. She thought her secret affection for the boy was unnoticed. She was wrong. Vincent, Dominic's observant enforcer, had seen the way the boy gravitated towards the maid. He had noted it in his meticulous mental ledger, but said nothing, assuming it was a harmless, temporary arrangement. None of them could have anticipated the catastrophic events that would soon tear their highly ordered world apart, forcing the invisible maid into the blinding, deadly spotlight of the Falconee syndicate. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The Long Island air was crisp, carrying the faint, salty tang of the Atlantic Ocean, and the sprawling gardens of the Falconee estate were bathed in golden, deceptive sunlight. Inside the main house, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Dominic was hosting an emergency summit in the fortified dining room. The Calabrese family, a brutal rival faction operating out of New Jersey, had recently encroached on Falconee territory, hijacking 3 major shipping containers at the docks. Retaliation was being planned, and the estate was on lockdown. Guards with earpieces and submachine guns hidden beneath their coats patrolled the perimeter. Because of the high security protocols, Leo's usual afternoon outing to the private beach had been cancelled. His current nanny, a strict, older woman named Mrs. Higgins, who despised the outdoors, had complained of a migraine. Sensing an opportunity to keep the boy calm amidst the heavy, aggressive energy radiating from the main house, Rosa had sharply ordered Amelia to take her cleaning supplies to the greenhouse and keep an eye on the boy. "Just keep him quiet, Amelia," Rosa had hissed, her eyes darting toward the closed doors of the dining room. "The Don is in a foul mood. If the boy has a panic attack today, heads will roll." Amelia had nodded, her heart secretly leaping. She found Leo in his playroom, staring blankly at a wall of untouched toys. When she tapped on the glass door and held up a small, illustrated book of Greek myths, his grey eyes instantly brightened. They retreated to the grand Victorian greenhouse, located at the edge of the manicured gardens, a stunning glass structure filled with exotic orchids, towering ferns, and a small, trickling koi pond. It was a beautiful, tranquil oasis, separated from the harsh reality of the Mafia stronghold by 100 yards of open lawn. Amelia set about wiping down the heavy wrought-iron tables, singing softly under her breath, while Leo sat cross-legged by the edge of the pond, dragging a small wooden boat through the water. For an hour, the world was peaceful. The humid air smelled of damp earth and jasmine. Then the world shattered. It started not with an explosion, but with a terrifying, wet thwack. Amelia, wiping a smudge from the greenhouse glass, saw it before she heard anything else. One of the perimeter guards, stationed near the high stone wall, suddenly jerked forward. A spray of crimson erupted from his neck, painting the white marble statues, and he crumpled to the grass without a sound. Suppressed weapons. Before her brain could fully process the sight, a delivery van, disguised in the livery of the estate's usual floral supplier, that had somehow cleared the front gates, suddenly accelerated, tearing through the pristine hedges and skidding to a halt between the main house and the greenhouse. The back doors kicked open. 4 men piled out. They weren't wearing masks. They wore tactical gear and carried matte black assault rifles. They were a hit squad sent by the Calabrese family, and they had insider knowledge to bypass the outer security ring. Their objective was clear. 2 men laid down heavy suppressive fire on the main house, shattering the reinforced windows of the dining room to pin Dominic and his men inside. The other 2 pivoted. They didn't look at the guards. They looked straight at the greenhouse. They were there to wipe out the Falconee bloodline. They were there for Leo. "Leo!" Amelia screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and panicked. The first bullet shattered the glass wall of the greenhouse, missing Amelia's head by inches and burying itself in a terracotta pot, exploding it into shrapnel. Leo froze. The sudden deafening sound of shattering glass and the shouting outside triggered his deepest trauma. He dropped his wooden boat. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He just stood up by the edge of the koi pond, his small body rigid, his hands clamped over his ears, staring wide-eyed at the men charging toward him through the ruined glass walls. Amelia was 20 feet away. The hitmen were raising their rifles, the red dot sights slicing through the humid air of the greenhouse, settling directly on the little boy's chest. There was no time to think. There was no time to weigh her life against his, no time to remember her debt or her sister Lily. There was only raw, blinding instinct. Amelia pushed off the ground with a force she didn't know she possessed. She sprinted across the slick, wet tiles, her apron tangling around her legs, diving horizontally into the air just as the first hitman squeezed his trigger. She hit Leo like a linebacker, wrapping her arms tightly around his small frame and twisting her body mid-air to place her back to the gunman as they both crashed hard onto the stone floor beside the pond. Crack! The first bullet hit her right shoulder. It felt like being struck by a swinging baseball bat engulfed in flames. The sheer kinetic force of the hollow point round shattered her clavicle, violently spinning her body. She gasped, a spray of saliva and blood leaving her lips, but she tightened her grip on Leo, crushing him against her chest, burying his face in her uniform so he wouldn't see. Crack! The second bullet tore through her side just below her ribcage. The pain was absolute, a blinding, white-hot agony that ripped the oxygen from her lungs. The world tilted, the colors of the orchids bleeding into a dizzying smear. She felt the hot rush of her own blood instantly soaking through her clothes, pooling on the stone beneath them. "Stay down, baby," she choked out, her voice a wet, ragged whisper in Leo's ear. "I've got you, I've got you." Crack! The third bullet found her lower back. Amelia let out a horrific, guttural cry as her nervous system overloaded. Her legs instantly went numb. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, shattered plant life, and copper. She lay draped heavily over the boy, unable to move, her vision fading to a pinpoint. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard the terrifying crunch of heavy boots on the broken glass inside the greenhouse. The hitman was standing over them. He was going to finish the job. He would shoot through her to get to the boy. Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, a tear carving a track through the dirt and blood on her cheek. "I'm sorry, Lily," she thought. She pulled Leo tighter, waiting for the final blow. But it never came. Instead, a roar that sounded like a wounded, enraged animal tore through the air, followed by the deafening, unsuppressed roar of a hand cannon. The hitman standing over them violently jerked backward, his chest cavity caved in by a heavy caliber round. He dropped to the floor, dead before he hit the tiles. Amelia struggled to open her heavy eyelids. Through the blur of agony, framed by the shattered glass of the greenhouse, she saw Dominic Falconee. He had broken through the suppressive fire, his tailored suit torn, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. He was firing a heavy magnum revolver with deadly precision, dropping the second hitman with a shot through the throat. Vincent and a dozen estate guards swarmed the lawn, overwhelming the remaining attackers in a hail of brutal, merciless gunfire. The threat was neutralized in less than 60 seconds. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of trickling water from the koi pond and the ragged, shallow gasps tearing from Amelia's throat. Dominic dropped his weapon and ran towards the greenhouse. He had seen the hitmen taking aim. He had seen the glass shatter. He knew he was too late. His heart, already encased in the ice of his past grief, shattered into a million pieces. He prepared himself to find his son's broken body. He slid to his knees on the bloody tiles, his hands shaking as he reached out. "Leo!" Dominic breathed, his voice cracking. Slowly, agonizingly, the blood-soaked Maid shifted. Amelia let out a whimper of pure agony as she used the last ounce of strength in her failing arms to push herself up slightly. Beneath her, completely untouched by the gunfire, was Leo. The boy's face was covered in Amelia's blood, his eyes wide with shock, but he was breathing. He was whole. Leo looked up at his father, then looked down at the pale, dying girl who had thrown herself into the line of fire for him. And for the first time in 3 years, the little boy made a sound. It was a piercing, heartbroken wail. "Amy!" Leo screamed, clutching at her bloody apron. "Amy, no!" Dominic froze. His son had spoken. His son was alive. And he was alive solely because this invisible, insignificant Maid had chosen to die in his place. Dominic looked down at Amelia. Her face was deathly pale. Her lips blue. Blood was expanding in a massive, horrific pool around them, staining the water of the koi pond crimson. Her eyes, filled with unspeakable pain, met his for a fleeting second before they rolled back into her head, and she collapsed completely, her body going limp over his son. "Vincent, get the SUV." Dominic's voice was a thunderclap, entirely stripped of its usual terrifying calm. It was the frantic, desperate roar of a father. He didn't wait for his men to secure the perimeter. He didn't look at the bodies of the Calabrese hitmen. Dominic shoved his hands under Amelia's ruined body, grimacing as his fingers slipped on her warm blood. He lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, her head lolling back against his shoulder, her golden hair plastered to her face with sweat and crimson. "Daddy, don't let her die. Don't let Amy die." Leo was hysterical, running alongside his father, his small hands stained red, gripping Dominic's torn suit jacket. "I won't. I swear to you, Leo, I won't," Dominic promised, though as he looked down at the gruesome wounds, one in the shoulder, a devastating exit wound on her side, and the fatal shot in her back, he knew he was making a promise he likely couldn't keep. An armored black Cadillac Escalade tore across the lawn, tearing up the pristine turf, stopping inches from them. Vincent threw open the back door. Dominic slid in, pulling Amelia across his lap, holding his hands over her deepest wounds, applying frantic pressure. "St. Jude S. the underground wing. Now, if you stop for anything, I will kill you myself," Dominic snarled at the driver. The heavy SUV peeled out, sirens blaring from its hidden grille, followed by a convoy of heavily armed guards. Inside the cab, the air was thick with the copper stench of blood. Dominic looked down at the girl. He didn't even know her last name. He recognized her vaguely. A shadow who cleaned the library, a quiet presence in the background of his dark life. Yet here she was, her life leaking out over his hands. She had taken 3 hollow-point bullets meant for his flesh and blood. In the brutal economy of the Mafia, loyalty was bought with fear and money, and it almost always failed when death came knocking. This girl had nothing. He paid her a pittance. Yet she had given everything. A profound, terrifying sense of debt settled heavily on Dominic's chest, The Falconee code was absolute, a life for a life. She had given her life for his son. Her life now belonged to him. He was not going to let the Reaper take what was his. They arrived at the loading dock of St. Jude's Medical Center in under 12 minutes. This wing was secretly funded by the Falconee Syndicate, a place where mobsters could be stitched up without police interference. A trauma team, alerted by Vincent, was waiting with a gurney. They pulled Amelia from Dominic's arms. 3 GSWs, hollow point, shoulder, flank, and lower lumbar. She's hypovolemic. Barely a pulse. No. The lead surgeon, Dr. Aris Gallagher, shouted as they rushed down the sterile white hallway. Dominic sprinted alongside them, his hands and shirt soaked in her blood, Leo clutched tightly to his side by Vincent. They crashed through the double doors of Trauma Bay 1. Nurses swarmed her, cutting away her ruined uniform. "She's crashing! Pressure is dropping, 60/40. We need to intubate," a nurse yelled over the frantic beeping of the monitors. Dr. Gallagher looked at the wounds and then turned to Dominic, his face pale. "Don Falconee, it's bad. The round in her side shredded her liver, and the one in her back is lodged dangerously close to the spine. She needs massive transfusions, but her blood type is O negative. We don't have enough in the underground reserve for a surgery this extensive." "Then get it from the main hospital upstairs," Dominic roared, grabbing the doctor by the collar of his scrubs. "I can't," Gallagher stammered, terrified. "Protocol, Don Falconee. O negative is highly restricted. To requisition that amount from the civilian blood bank, to bring in the specialized neurosurgeon needed for the spinal extraction. We have to admit her into the official system. We have to report the gunshot wounds to the NYPD. And worse, the hospital board upstairs. The Calabrese family has heavily infiltrated it. If they find out the girl who saved your son is lying vulnerable in the ICU, they will send someone to finish her off by cutting her oxygen or poisoning her IV. I can only bypass the board and the police if she is immediate, high-ranking family. Only family has the absolute right to demand private, off-the-books trauma care under the hospital's elite VIP charter. Dominic's mind raced. If they reported her, the police would swarm them, complicating his retaliation. If she went into the main system, the Calabrese assassins, who had just brazenly attacked his home, would easily find a way into a hospital room to ensure the only witness and the hero of the day was dead. A Maid was expendable collateral. The hospital board would ask questions, delay treatments, demand next-of-kin authorizations that didn't exist. She would bleed out while bureaucrats argued. She needed untouchable status. She needed to be draped in the absolute, terrifying protection of the Falconee name. If she was a Falconee, the entire hospital would bow to her needs immediately. No questions asked, no police involved. The Calabrese wouldn't dare touch her, knowing it would mean full-scale, apocalyptic war. Dominic looked at the monitor. Her heart rate was slowing. The flatline was seconds away. "Vincent," Dominic commanded, his voice suddenly dropping to a chilling, absolute calm. "Bring Father Thomas. He's downstairs in the chapel." Vincent blinked, confused for a fraction of a second, before realization dawned on his face. "Boss, you can't be serious. She's a Maid." "She is the savior of my bloodline," Dominic hissed, his grey eyes flashing with lethal intent. "Do it, now." Within 2 minutes, a trembling, elderly priest was shoved into the chaotic trauma bay. Dr. Gallagher and his team were frantically trying to pack Amelia's wounds, shouting about declining vitals. "Get out of the way, Doc. Just keep her heart beating for 2 more minutes," Dominic ordered, pushing past a nurse to stand at the head of the operating table. He looked down at Amelia. She was unconscious, a tube down her throat, her skin translucent. "Father, begin the rites of matrimony," Dominic ordered, taking her cold, blood-stained left hand in his. "Dominic, my son, this is highly irregular. The girl is dying. She cannot consent," Father Thomas stammered, looking at the horrifying scene. Dominic pulled his heavy, custom-made platinum signet ring, the crest of the Falconee Don, from his pinky finger. She consented when she took 3 bullets for my son. I am giving her the protection of my name so these doctors can save her life. If you don't marry us right now, Father, I will introduce you to God myself. Read the rites." The priest, terrified and sweating, rapidly began murmuring the Latin rites over the chaotic sounds of the trauma bay. "Do you, Dominic, take this woman?" "I do," Dominic said firmly, his eyes locked on the faint, erratic rising and falling of Amelia's chest. "Fight," he thought. "Fight, damn you. You don't get to die on me. And by the power vested in me. In the eyes of God, I pronounce you husband and wife." The priest rushed out, crossing himself frantically. Dominic slid his heavy platinum signet ring onto Amelia's bloodied ring finger. It was far too big, but it gleamed under the harsh surgical lights, a heavy, unbreakable shackle to the underworld, and the only thing keeping her tethered to the living. Dominic turned back to the trembling surgeon. The frantic energy of the room seemed to freeze under the Don's icy glare. "She is no longer a maid," Dominic stated, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. "Her name is Amelia Falconee. She is the wife of the Don. She is the mother of the heir. You will empty the civilian blood bank. You will fly in the best neurosurgeon on the East Coast. You will do whatever it takes to save my wife. And if she dies on this table, Doctor, you will join her." The doctor swallowed hard, the legal and medical barriers instantly obliterated by the sheer, imposing reality of the Mafia boss's declaration. "Yes, Don Falconee, get her to Ore 1, now! Move, move, move!" Gallagher screamed. The team instantly mobilized by the threat of death. They rushed the gurney out of the room. Dominic stood in the empty trauma bay, his hands dripping with the blood of his new bride. He looked at Vincent, who stood silently in the doorway with Leo. "Put 100 men around this hospital," Dominic ordered quietly, wiping a streak of blood from his jaw. "Nobody gets in or out, and find out exactly who authorized the gate clearance for that floral van. Tonight, the Calabrese family burns." He had saved her from the immediate bureaucracy of death, binding her to him in blood and vows. But as Dominic watched the doors of the operating room swing shut, a terrifying realization settled in his gut. If she survived the night, the quiet, invisible maid would wake up to a reality far more dangerous than the bullets she had taken. She would wake up as the queen of the Falconee syndicate, chained to a ruthless monster who had just realized he owed her his soul. For 3 days, Amelia existed in a terrifying, twilight world of fire and ice. She floated through fractured dreams of shattering glass, the deafening roar of Dominic's magnum, and the terrified, blood-streaked face of little Leo. Every time she tried to claw her way to the surface of consciousness, a heavy, suffocating pain in her spine would drag her back into the dark. When she finally opened her eyes, the world was no longer the humid, shattered greenhouse. It was a stark, sterile room, bathed in muted, artificial light. The rhythmic beep-beep-beep of a heart monitor was the only sound. Her body felt like it was encased in lead. A thick network of IV tubes snaked from her bruised arms, delivering a steady stream of morphine and broad-spectrum antibiotics. Amelia tried to swallow, her throat feeling like sandpaper. She attempted to shift her weight, but a blinding, electric shock of agony radiated from her lower back, stealing the breath from her lungs. She let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Immediately, a shadow in the corner of the room moved. Dominic Falconee stepped into the dim light. He looked entirely out of place in the clinical environment. He wore a crisp, midnight blue Tom Ford suit, but his tie was discarded, and the top buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing the edge of a dark tattoo on his collarbone. Deep, exhaustion-carved shadows rimmed his intense grey eyes. He hadn't left the underground VIP wing of St. Jude's since the doors of OR1 had swung shut 72 hours ago. "Don't move," Dominic commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a strange shiver down her spine. "The neurosurgeon had to fuse your L4 and L5 vertebrae. The bullet missed severing your spinal cord by 2 millimeters. You're lucky to be breathing, let alone not paralyzed." Amelia blinked, her heavily medicated brain struggling to process his words. The Don was speaking to her, not barking an order at a servant, but speaking to her directly. "Leo," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Is he—"
"No."
Dominic stepped closer to the edge of the bed. For a fraction of a second, the icy, impenetrable mask of the Mafia boss cracked, revealing the devastatingly relieved father underneath. "He is safe. He doesn't have a scratch on him. Because of you." Amelia let her eyes slide shut, a profound wave of relief washing over her. "Good. Why did you do it?" Dominic asked, the question hanging heavy in the sterile air. It was a calculation he couldn't solve. His world operated on leverage, fear, and profit. A maid making $15 an hour, throwing herself in front of a firing squad for another man's child, broke every rule of his brutal reality. Amelia opened her eyes, looking at the man who terrified half the eastern seaboard. He was just a little boy. He was terrified. I couldn't let them hurt him. It was that simple for her. Dominic stared at her, an unreadable expression settling over his sharp features. He slowly reached out, his large, calloused hand